In the summer of 2015, a team of marine archaeologists from Black Swan Maritime Heritage was working in the shallow waters off the coast of the Bahamas when their magnetometers detected a large metallic anomaly at a depth of about 8 meters, buried under nearly a meter of calcareous sediment. What they found when they excavated with low-pressure hydraulic vacuums over the following weeks was one of the most significant underwater archaeological finds recorded in the Caribbean in the 21st century. The scattered remains of a 16th-century Spanish galleon, and alongside them, a collection of artifacts that included gold and silver coins minted at the Seville Mint, silver ingots marked with royal seals, rough emeralds from the Muzo mines in present-day Colombia, and fragments of Talavera pottery that confirmed the origin and age of the shipwreck. The find was not just a treasure in the conventional sense of the word. It was a submerged historical archive that shed new light on the routes of the Indies fleet, and on the last days of a ship whose history had been buried under the centuries along with its cargo. Like, subscribe and share. Let's begin. For more than 2 centuries, the Caribbean was the busiest and most dangerous maritime corridor in the Western world. Between 1500 and 1800, the Spanish crown sent more than 20,000 ships across those waters laden with the products of the New World. Silver from Potosi, gold from the New Kingdom of Granada, pearls from Margarita Island, indigo from Central America, cochineal from Mexico, and emeralds from the Andes. Of those 20,000 ships, it is estimated that between 10 and 15% never returned to Spain. Some were sunk by pirates and privateers. Others were destroyed by Atlantic hurricanes. Many simply ran aground on the poorly mapped reefs of a sea that 16th-century navigators knew only imperfectly, and that held within its depths a historical wealth that modern marine archaeologists have only just begun to systematize. The Institute of Nautical Archaeology, based at Texas A&M University, estimates that between 2,000 and 3,000 shipwrecks from the Spanish colonial era remain unstudied in the waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, most of which have not been identified or precisely located. The galleon discovered by the Black Swan team in 2015 was provisionally identified through analysis of recovered coins. Their mintage dates and dyes allowed researchers to narrow down the sinking to a period between 1572 and 1589. The oldest coins in the collection featured the bust of Philip II and had been minted in Mexico City between 1572 and 1576, establishing the terminus postquem of the shipwreck. The absence of coins later than 1589, along with the type of anchor recovered and the design of the cannons, consistent with Spanish naval artillery of the late 16th century, suggested a sinking around the last decade of that century. The archives of the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, consulted by the researchers after the initial discovery, record at least 4 shipwrecks of galleons from the Indies fleet in the Bahamas area between 1580 and 1595. Although the position data in the historical records are too imprecise to identify with certainty which of them corresponds to the remains found, the emeralds recovered from the site deserve special mention because their geochemical analysis provided extraordinarily valuable information about the colonial trade networks the ship carried. Colombian emeralds have a characteristic isotopic signature that allows them to be distinguished from stones from other deposits around the world, such as those in Zambia, Brazil, or Afghanistan. The analysis carried out at the Gemology Laboratory of Ghent University confirmed that the recovered pieces came from the Muzo mines, in what is now the Department of Boyaca, Colombia, which was then and remains today the world's leading source of high-quality emeralds. The Muzo mines were discovered by the Spanish around 1537 and quickly became a strategic source of wealth for the crown, which monopolized their exploitation through the royal licensing system. The emeralds traveled from Muzo to the port of Cartagena de Indias, where they were loaded onto the fleet's galleons along with silver from the mines of Potosi in Upper Peru. The fact that the galleon found in the Bahamas was carrying stones from Muzo placed the shipwreck within that trade route with a precision that historical documents alone could not have provided. Underwater archaeology in the Caribbean has a complex history that includes both remarkable scientific achievements and controversies over the ownership and fate of recovered artifacts. During the 1970s and 1980s, the search for Spanish galleons in the Caribbean was dominated by private treasure hunters, among whom Mel Fisher became the most famous thanks to the 1985 discovery of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, a Spanish galleon sunk in 1622 off the coast of the Florida Keys that carried one of the most valuable documented cargoes of the Spanish treasure fleet. The recovery of the Atocha sparked a years-long legal battle between Fisher, the state of Florida, and the Spanish government over ownership of the artifacts, which was ultimately resolved in Fisher's favor by U.S. federal courts under the doctrine of the law of the sea. That case established legal precedents that still complicate the management of underwater archaeological heritage in international waters because the boundary between scientific archaeology and the commercial extraction of historical artifacts remains a disputed territory where national and international legal frameworks do not always offer clear answers. Like, subscribe, and share. The 2015 discovery benefited from a different legal and scientific context than existed in Mel Fisher's time. The Bahamas had updated its underwater heritage legislation in 2011, requiring that any archaeological excavation be directed by certified archaeologists, that recovered objects be thoroughly documented before any movement, and that the Bahamian government have the right of first refusal on artifacts of historical significance. The Black Swan team worked under these conditions, ensuring that the recovered objects underwent a rigorous archaeological documentation process before being transferred to conservation facilities. The silver coins, severely corroded by silver sulfide after 4 centuries of immersion in salt water, were treated with electrolytic reduction techniques in the conservation laboratory of the National Museum of the Bahamas. The emeralds, which are relatively resistant to marine corrosion due to their chemical nature, could be examined in a near-original state, facilitating the gemological analysis that established their Colombian origin. Beyond the intrinsic value of the recovered objects, the 2015 discovery yielded scientific data that colonial history researchers consider of paramount importance. Analysis of the silver ingots, performed using X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, revealed that the metal came from at least 2 different sources. Most showed the isotopic composition characteristic of silver from Potosi in present-day Bolivia, but a subset of ingots exhibited a different signature, consistent with silver from the Zacatecas mines in Mexico. This combination of sources in a single galleon cargo was unusual in known documentary records and suggests that the ship had stopped at ports in New Spain before completing its loading in Cartagena or Portobello, implying a more complex route than the cargo manifests preserved in the General Archive of the Indies had suggested. This type of detail, impossible to recover from historical documents alone and only accessible through direct scientific analysis of artifacts, perfectly illustrates why rigorous underwater archaeology is irreplaceable as a source of historical knowledge. The Caribbean remains one of the richest and least explored territories for underwater archaeology worldwide. Visibility and water temperature conditions in many areas are favorable for diving, and the relatively shallow depth of the main reefs and banks where most colonial shipwrecks occurred makes many sites technically accessible with conventional diving equipment. The main obstacle to their systematic study is not technical but institutional and financial. Caribbean countries have widely varying capacities to manage and protect their underwater heritage, and the resources available for scientific marine archaeology are insufficient relative to the magnitude of the heritage that exists in these waters. Organizations such as the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and UNESCO work with the region's governments to develop coherent legal frameworks and training programs for local archaeologists, but the process is slow compared to the rate at which natural deterioration and the activity of unauthorized scavengers continue to erode the sites. What divers found in the Bahamas in 2015 is only a fraction of what the Caribbean still holds beneath its turquoise waters, a historical archive of extraordinary dimensions that patiently awaits science and institutions to live up to its importance. The impact of discoveries like the one in 2015 also extends to the field of underwater cultural heritage conservation globally. The UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, adopted in 2001 and ratified by 72 countries to date, stipulates that submerged archaeological remains older than 100 years should be protected in situ whenever possible, prioritizing their scientific study over their extraction for commercial purposes. This philosophy represents a fundamental shift from the practices of previous decades, when the recovery of objects for sale in the antiquities market was considered by many private operators to be the primary activity and archaeological documentation a secondary obligation. The effective implementation of the convention remains uneven in the Caribbean, where several states of significant underwater heritage, such as the United States, Cuba, and Colombia, have not ratified it, creating legal vacuums that hinder the coordinated protection of sites spanning multiple maritime borders. However, The 2015 Bahamian case demonstrated that when local institutions operate rigorously and private operators agree to work within strict scientific frameworks, it is possible to combine the active search for deposits with the preservation of the historical knowledge that those deposits contain. The technology available for underwater archaeology in the Caribbean has undergone a remarkable transformation in the last 15 years. High-resolution underwater photogrammetry, which allows for the construction of precise three-dimensional models of a site from thousands of photographs taken from different angles, has replaced traditional two-dimensional documentation methods using drawings and manual measurements in many excavations. Side-scan sonar mounted on autonomous underwater vehicles now allows for the inspection of hundreds of hectares of seabed in just a few hours, identifying topographic and metallic anomalies that can then be investigated in greater detail by divers or ROVs. Stable isotope and trace element analysis using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry allows for the determination of the geographic origin of metals and minerals with a level of precision unimaginable 2 decades ago. All these tools, applied in an integrated way in projects like the one that discovered the Bahamian galleon, are transforming underwater archaeology from a discipline based on the chance search and recovery of objects into a science capable of rigorously reconstructing trade networks, shipping routes, and historical events that written documents only incompletely recorded. The 16th century treasures that lie beneath the Caribbean are not just gold and silver, they are pages of history that only the seabed has preserved intact. Like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.